Hey guys, and welcome back to session 2 of our FastAPI series. Now, to kick things off, I want to quickly go through our video aims, and the bulk of this session is going to be about accepting and dealing with data that is posted to our FastAPI program. So, we're going to be looking at accepting post requests. It's a touch bigger for you. And the crux of this bit is going to be something called Pydantic. Now, effectively what this is a tool which is generally used with FastAPI, in my opinion, and it effectively defines a model for what it wants data to look like as it comes in. So, say for example, you have an API that accepts someone's name, maybe their age, and some scores for that user, wherever it might be. Suppose it's like some kind of video game. You might want the name, maybe the score, to be in like a really certain specific style. Otherwise, that might break your API. Pydantic effectively provides a template for what that data should look like, and it will kick off if the data is not in that exact style. So it's really nice to use with FastAPI. We're going to also show you how to use curl to send a payload in JSON form. Thirdly, I want to be splitting up our code into roots as well. So at the moment, we have this kind of basic folder structure here. We've got main, we've got our roots defined in here. We're actually going to be defining the app here. We're going to create a folder to house our roots. So these guys are going to go off into their own separate folder, into their own separate modules. Those will then be imported into here and added into this. So it's a nice way to kind of split off our API. In the real world, you're going to have, in a proper API, you'll have all your roots in one place. You might have all of your processing stuff in another. So we're going to be looking at kind of splitting off our code into its relevant bits. It just keeps things nice and clean and straightforward. The last thing we want to do is have all of our stuff inside one file. That's not good for anyone. It's really convoluted and yeah, it looks really messy as well. And to finish this video off, we're going to do a full worked example where we're going to be posting some data to our FastAPI and then using Pandas to open a CSV file and then write that data to the bottom of a CSV. Let's get started with accepting post requests. Now, the first thing I want to do is head into my main.py here. I'm going to get rid of this get one for now. This is no longer relevant. I can keep this one for the time being, and I'm going to be modifying this one later on. Now, if I head back to my video aims here, we said here that we're going to be using Pydantic. So let's get our virtual environment activated. Mine's deactivated from the previous session, so I need to reactivate it. Once it's reactivated, I then need to install Pydantic into this environment. We can then use Poetry to bring in Pydantic. Make sure when you do so, you are at the same level as your pyproject.toml file. In this case, I've already had it installed, but that's absolutely fine. Yours will look a bit different to this. And if you want to verify it's there, just head into your toml file. And there we go. I can see Pydantic is installed along with Python, FastAPI, and Uvicorn. Just as a recap, we're using Uvicorn to run the server, and FastAPI, of course, that's always going to be there. Now then, let's head back into main. And the way this works is that we first define a model. So what I need to do up here is import Pydantic and now define this model. And then the way this works is that we now define a class that, to be honest, which it looks a little bit like a data class, except we are going to inherit from this here. So we can say class, and in this case here, let me give you a sneak peek as to what our request is going to be. I'm going to be sending this post request here. So my data is going to contain a name as a string, a math score, and an English score, and these are both going to be integers. So I want to make sure I've got this, this, and this as my fields. So I can say class, and let's call this score. This is going to inherit from base model. Of course, this is from Pydantic, so this will give us all of the Pydantic features, which is good. And we can simply say, let's take this exactly as I've got it here. So we'll do name here first and say you are going to be a string. And I can then do the same for my math score and English score, and then define these both as integers. And that's my basic base model done here. I'm going to finish this off with a quick docstring. There we go, not the most informative, but it's always good to have a docstring that gives a basic summary as to what a class, function, or method is doing. So in this case, this is simply saying we have a name, 2 types of scores, and we have the types clearly defined here as well. Now what I can do is come down to my post endpoint from last time, and I want to change this from hello world post to, let's call this submit score here. For the time being, I'm going to leave this as it is, but we are going to change it once we have some stuff posted. We're also going to change goodbye to something a bit more relevant. Let's call this submit score here. Now inside our parameter section for this function, we want to actually put something in. So we're going to say taken score, and the type annotation for this is this here, score. And this is where Pydantic comes in. So envision like a normal type hint. Normally your type hints don't have any kind of like strict checking or enforcing. This is not the case with Pydantic. Pydantic, as it sort of suggests, is pedantic about what is passed in. If the thing you pass in as score doesn't look like this, Pydantic is going to let you know, and this will return a message to indicate that, the thing you've posted to this endpoint is not what I was expecting. So we can go ahead and get this ran, and let's give this a try by posting this data here to our API. The only thing I had to change is hello world post to the name of this endpoint here, which is submit score. Okay, this looks good to go. Now just as a recap, this is posting to localhost and port 5050, looking for the endpoint submit score. Because this is doing a curl x post, of course we need to make sure that this is actually saying post, and it is, which is good. So if I quickly head to my README, I can just look at this here again. Just as a recap, this is basically telling Uvicorn to run the app in a server, exposing it on port 5050. Because this is doing main app, I need to be sure that I'm in the same directory where this main.py file is. So right now I'm not, so I need to go cd my app, and there we go, main.py. So we can take this, it should fire up. Okay, looks good. Now we can go over to my second terminal, and I can take this, copy, and paste into the terminal. And there we go, so I've been posted to yay. Okay, now if I come back into main for a second, and let's just do, let's type received here, and then we will then do score. At the moment this isn't auto reloading, so what you can do is just do -- reload here, and this will now reload each time I save this with a change. So if I hit run again, looks good, head back to this, and we can see received, and when I print off score here, check this out, it's received name as John, math score 66, English score as 85. Now then, let's come back in here and let's try something else. Now let's try the same post request, but this time let's try and do something different. Rather than passing in English score, we'll pass in English scores. In this case here, this is actually giving us an error message. If I come to the app for a second, it's given us a 422, basically saying the thing that this received could not be processed, and that's purely because of this Pydantic model here. So it didn't receive name, math score, English score. It actually received English scores. So just that S at the end of English score made Pydantic very unhappy. And we can see here, this bit, it's highlighted here what has gone wrong. In fact, if we clear that, and let's go back and do, let's go to here, shall we? Let's do both wrong. So you can see math score is not like this here, and it's got English score not like that there as well. So it will always kind of give you some feedback as to what fields it doesn't like about your post request. And this highlights the point as to how important Pydantic can be. If you're building an API that has a really kind of stringent and strict thing that it has to be given, in this case here, if you want it to look like this every time, Pydantic basically ensures that the data can either look like this and come in and be processed, or if not, it's going to give back a 422 and give back some error message to the person who is now posting bad stuff to your API. What we can do now is give some simple feedback. So we can see that these have fields of name, math score, and English score. Let's do some basic text here to give a message back to the user upon a successful post. We can remove our print statement, hit save. Don't forget hitting save will auto reload. And let's come back here, clear that, and we'll submit this again. There we go, message, thanks John. So in this case here, because that's gone through and it's been fine, it's given us a nice little payload response to say, yep, thanks John, that's all received. And that's obviously just by taking the name attribute from the score object here. Now later on in the video, we're going to look at how to do some error handling here as well. Of course, when we come down to our last bit here, we're going to make this endpoint a bit more complex as well. But for now, that is how we use Pydantic to make our FastAPI instance, accept some data, and apply some simple validation upon the payload. Next up, we're going to look at separating routes into their own modules. Now, the benefit of this is mainly noticeable when you have a really large API. So if I come into main.py, we've got our single endpoint here. And for applications which are really small, or if you're just testing out FastAPI, this is probably okay. However, when your API gets really big and has lots of endpoints, it can be quite a nice idea to have all your routes in their own module. So what I'm going to do inside my app is do new folder. I'm going to create a folder called routes. Inside this, I'm going to create a blank init just to make it so that this works. There we go, init.py. This lets us import things from this nice and easily. So any folder I've made, I've got a blank init.py. So just bear that in mind for the time being. Now, with this closed, and this closed here, what I can start to do inside my routes folder is define each individual route as its own file. I'm going to be calling a new file, submit scores. And then what I can now do is come to main.py, just pinch this here for a second, and just temporarily put this here, but make it commented out. Inside this file, we're going to be creating a router, adding this to the router, and then this main.py is going to import this router and add it into this here. So let's get this set up. We can then create a router object from this here. And then all we need to do now is replace app.post with router.post. See how we're still missing this here? That's because we need to pinch this from here. So we can take this in its entirety, make sure that's all saved, come back to this here and put that there. So we have our Pydantic import to handle this. We have our API router imported to handle this. We've defined a route, which is still a post route, exactly the same as earlier, and added it to this router here. I think what I want to do is just do a bit of housekeeping. We'll put this here, and let's just do this quick doc string. And there we go, that's all good. So let's space this out, make sure it's got the correct number of spaces. We'll keep one space in between each one. So now this is defined, what we now need to do is go back to main.py and import all of this. So bear in mind that this has this router object with this added to it. So router object with a single post endpoint. So back to main, and we can now do the following. So we'll do myapp.routes.submit scores, and we'll do import router, just like this. Now we can use the include router method on the application object. Just make sure that these line up. So in this case, in submit scores, router was called router, which is the API router object. This was now being imported into my main program here. So just make sure that this, and this all line up. With that said, we can now give this a go at running. And it looks like it's good. So if this didn't work for whatever reason, you would know. Like if this was routers, for example, you would get this here. So let's try and rerun that. And what I want to do now is come back to my terminal here, and let's try and do the same curl. It's all good, that's worked. So now look how simple and streamlined our application is. What you could even do is put this inside its own function. So we could do def create application. This returns a FastAPI object, and we'll do this here and do return app. And underneath here, we'll do app is equal to create app. Let's quickly restart this, make sure it's all happy. It is. We'll then do the same curl, and that's happy as well. So let's just do a quick doc string for this. And there we have it. That's a nice, simple app defined. Routes have been imported and then added into the app. And to be honest, this is the bulk of what you're going to be doing. You quite often have to define your routes, import them into here, and you kind of just go from there. It's a very iterative process. So in a nutshell, let's just quickly recap that one more time. In my submit scores, I defined an API router, created an instance of the API router, and I literally just took the endpoint from earlier. The only difference here is rather than doing app.post, I did router.post. Once that's done, we simply went back to main.py, imported that router, and then did app.includeRouter, router. And all I've done here is simply wrap it up in a nice function, and it's good to go. For the final part of the video, I'm going to do a quick worked example, and this is simply going to be using Pandas to take some stuff that's been put into our API and just write it into a CSV. I've got this kind of already written, so I'm just going to show you how I would sort of set this up. I don't want to focus too much on the Pandas code in this case. What I would recommend, of course, is just getting it installed. Poetry add pandas. My VM is already activated, so I can just run this. Mine is already installed, so of course yours might be different. We can clear this here. Now the way I would do this is, seeing as we had this routes folder defined, I'd want to add a separate folder for processing. Keep this here, and of course let's give it a blank init file, and we'll create a new file for adding to a CSV file. There we go, that's good. I'm going to paste in the code, which I've pre-written. The only thing I don't have is my imports, so I can import those now. I'm going to need OS, and we're going to be needing pandas. Okay, there we go. And do a quick docstring, add records to a CSV file. Really briefly, all this is doing is defining a simple function which takes file name, math score, and English score. In this case, I can actually get rid of file name altogether. I'm going to keep this hard-coded in. So bear in mind, if we come back to our roots for a second, this is taking in name, math score, and English score. And what I want to do is effectively call this function inside this root here. So I head back for a second. I'll be passing the name, the math score, and the English score. We'll create a new data frame and basically say, if the file exists, go ahead and append to it. If it doesn't, however, go ahead and use W mode to write it. Of course, this isn't a Pandas video. This is just some simple boilerplate code to do this task. But what I do want to show with this is, suppose, for example, something goes wrong here. What you can do is tell FastAPI to return a code of 500 with an error message. A 500 normally is done for like an internal server error. So we can simulate this, try and catch that error here, and return a 500 back to the user. So I can now import my add to CSV file in here. Not the best naming, I know, but just to show kind of how FastAPI would do this. So we'll do the same as earlier. So it's going to be from my app, dot processing folder, and the file is dot add to CSV. Add to CSV, and I'm going to be importing, let's see, there we go, and student score. Thought it would pick it up. Okay, and I want to quickly run this, check it's happy with the import. Yep, that looks good. So let's just kind of figure out how this is going to happen. We want to be calling this function inside this here. So if I do add student score and open this up, see if we can get the type hints to work. Yeah, there we go. It wants name, math score, English score. I think what I will do is just make the type hints match. So name is a string, math score, you can be an integer, and English score, you can have the same treatment. And there we go. Now let's see what we're doing here. Score.name, it's going to be score.mathscore. No, like that. And finally, we can do score. Let's see what our final one is. English score. There we go. Okay, now with nothing done, let's check if I can get all this closed for a second. We should see, when I run this, a CSV file be created. So with some luck, I can run this endpoint and look at this, record CSV. John 6685. Let's try and do it again. Let's just quickly change the name. So if this works this time, I should see a new row added. Let's suppose John S has the same score. And there we go. Nice. I'm pretty happy with that. That looks good. Okay, let's come back into submit scores here. So what I'd like to do is kind of wrap this up with a bit of error handling. So let's suppose, for example, something goes drastically wrong. Let's try and force an error to happen here. Let's pass in like an inappropriate mode. Let's do like T or something like that. We'll run this. We'll try and call this again. And there we go, internal server error here. Now, this basically indicates that something has gone wrong. If we head into Python here, there we go, we should see there's our full kind of trace back here. And now what we're going to be doing is effectively saying in here, try and do this. However, if there is some exception, return a 500. Now, this is where it gets a bit tricky because this can go wrong in a number of different ways. You might have permissions errors, might be OS errors, the file might be used by someone else. You don't know what it's going to be. So what I'm going to do in this case, which is not the best practice admittedly, is do like a blanket exception. So we can say try, do this here. However, if you catch any exception, do so as exe. And the way to do this, in my view, which I think is best, is to do from FastAPI, import, and it's called HTTP exception here. And what this does, this is actually something that you can return. And we do so by doing raise HTTP exception, see? And then we can pass in a status code. I can then pass in under the detail parameter some error. We'll make this a bit more interesting in just a second. I know I've not used that for now, but yeah, not to worry. And let's try and recall this endpoint. So we'll do this, and we'll see how we get detail, some error. Now what we can do is we can do the following. So let's just say, oops, do this here, exe. So what this is doing, the contents of the exception are basically being saved into this variable as a string. That means we can now return that string back to the user. So we make sure this is a bit bigger because it's probably going to give us back a fairly big string here. Clear the screen and hit this. And there we are. Must have exactly one of create, read, write, append mode, and at most 1 plus. Yeah, so that's probably in response to me doing T as this is. If I remove those, put this back as normal, that should have reloaded. And now hit this. Message, thanks, John S. Cool, there we go. I'm all happy with that. I know it's a fairly trivial example, but this is generally what you're going to be doing with APIs. You're going to be defining some application. In this case, let's go back to it. It's in main. This application then has routes added to it. So let's see how I've done that again. I'd first defined a route here. So I imported API router, defined a router, and then added an endpoint to that router. The router itself has a task that it's doing. So in this case, it's adding student score, and that is a simple function to add stuff to a Pandas data frame and save it. If that goes well, no problem. It's going to return a little message saying, yeah, thanks, John, in this case. However, if something goes wrong during this process, we're going to be asking FastAPI to raise a HTTP exception with a status code of 500, which is pretty common to say something's gone wrong in the server, along with a little string here. And there we have it, guys. That is my kind of video on posting data into FastAPI. We've also looked at Pydantic as well, so I hope that's been really helpful. If ever any questions or any suggestions on how to make this code better, feel free to ping us a message. And of course, make sure you are subscribed for the most recent videos in this series. Cheers for watching, guys, and have a great rest of your week.